Thank you very much, Quinn, for the introduction. My name is Danilo Petranovic. I'm the director of the Abigail Adams Institute, a not-for-profit independent academic institute here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We're very proud to co-sponsor today's event with our student friends in the John Adams Society, and we are, I think of us sometimes as the Adams family of initiatives and programs at Harvard University, or certainly we appear to be, the John Adams Society and the Abigail Adams Institute. Each year, the Abigail Adams Institute will host a public lecture in order to introduce arguments and speakers who can expand the philosophical horizons of our audience and have them reimagine the intellectual and cultural possibilities of the present. This is the first lecture. If you want to learn more about the Institute, please reach out to me after the talk, or to my colleague Ann Kay there in the back. Or you can grab some of our literature, a copy of some of our most recent products, and there you can see for yourself a little bit about what is it that we do, what is it that we're interested in. Great. Okay. So it is my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to a very special talk. 39 years ago, on the occasion of its 327th commencement, Harvard University welcomed Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian dissident patriot, to speak to this intellectual community. Solzhenitsyn delivered what has been described by one Harvard professor who was present that day as, quote, the most, unhappily the only, memorable commencement speech, end quote, in his nearly now 60 years at Harvard. Solzhenitsyn, in that commencement address, painted with rough strokes, but clearly enough. The Western mistake was to turn our backs on the classical metaphysical tradition, which had perhaps grown to excess and come to a natural end in the Middle Ages, and to embrace materialism with an unwarranted zeal. Under the materialist idea, there was no intrinsic evil and no higher task than to attain happiness on earth. Happiness is to be understood as physical well-being and the accumulation of material goods, and anything beyond these was left outside the attention of the state and society to the option of the individual, as if there was nothing higher than matter in human life. The scope of today's remarks is first and foremost about the malaise in contemporary Europe. But do not fret, as the larger political and metaphysical trajectory will not be neglected and will indeed be integral to explaining some of the peculiar social trends we're witnessing today in Europe and elsewhere. Our speaker today is both a politician and a philosopher. Long active in the Polish anti-communist movement, he has held a number of important positions in the Polish government, serving as Minister of Education, Secretary of State and Chancellor President Lech Kaczynski, and Deputy Speaker of the Senate. He's now a member of the European Parliament and Deputy Chairman of the European Conservatives and Reformists group. He's also a Professor of Philosophy at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, his hometown, and the author of a number of works in political philosophy and ancient philosophy, including most recently a study of Socrates. Today's talk will be based on his book, titled, I have it here, The Demon in Democracy, Totalitarian Temptations in Free Societies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ryszard Legutko to the Adams family at Harvard.
Good afternoon. Well, first, let me thank the Adams family for bringing me over here. I greatly appreciate the honor of coming here and having an opportunity to talk about my book and the ideas that are somehow related to the book, which I think are quite topical and worth discussing in such awesome environment and here in front of such a distinguished audience. So I really am happy to be here, and I will occupy some of your time to explain the circumstances which led me to write the book called The Demon in Democracy, and I will also try to shed some light on the argument and potential consequences on what I write in the book. So the thesis of the book is rather simple, and it may be summarized in one sentence. That is, despite enormous differences that are clear to everyone with elementary intelligence and knowledge, the differences that should not be minimized or neglected, there is a considerable resemblance between communism and liberal democracy. That's the thesis. And it meets immediately with two contradictory counter-arguments. The first counter-argument is, this is simply a nonsense. The differences between the two systems are so great that no sane person can seriously think that a totalitarian regime responsible for the death of millions of people can be even remotely similar to modern liberal democracy with its multi-party system and a thriving civil society. The other counter-argument is that today calling political arrangements totalitarian or fascist or Stalinist or authoritarian or Orwellian has become a sort of cliche and has been a standard rhetorical weapon used to excess by a lot of people. So if we take these two counter-arguments together, we can say that the thesis of my book is both an outrageous absurdity and a political cliche. Now, not surprisingly, I believe that my book is neither. But before I summarize the book's argument, let me describe my personal experience, which when we arrive at the ideas that constitute the backbone of the book. And then I will try to explain the thesis and present my arguments, and I will conclude with some additional remarks. So let me start on a personal note. So for a person like myself, living for a long time in a communist society, being born in an radically anti-communist family, and being consistently anti-communist since the day I was born, it was obvious for me and for people like myself that Western liberal democracy is the opposite of what Ronald Reagan called the evil empire. And this expression, the evil empire, we welcomed wholeheartedly, and we are very happy that somebody called a spade a spade. So the Western democracy was thought to be the opposite of communism, not only because it offered people freedom and dignity we were deprived of, but also we believed that it was an outcome of a long civilizational and cultural process. The Western system reflected that what we believed, not literally, of course, but not only symbolically either. It reflected the best of what the West created. From Greek philosophy, Roman law, Christian religion, the spirit of scientific inquiry, technology, cultural civility, and so on and so forth. So living in a communist society was for us like living outside the civilization. And when the system collapsed, it was for us like rejoining, right, the Western civilization, not only politically and economically, but also intellectually, philosophically, spiritually. Of course, we knew the West had its problems. We knew that, particularly its soft spot for communism, but we thought that it was just a minor problem and soon will disappear. But after the regime collapsed, and in my country it happened in 1989, it collapsed almost overnight. Well, probably I exaggerated somewhat, but in a very short period of time. So after the old regime collapsed, I experienced several major disappointments, which made me rethink and soon revise my enthusiasm for theory and practice of liberal democracy. A period of joyful expectations was short, it ended, and then came a critical reflection. And the direct stimulus that was a feeling, a harrowing feeling that got hold of me, a feeling that a mental world I was beginning to live in was not much different from what had surrounded me in the past. The expression a mental world is somewhat obscure, right? But I cannot find a better one. So perhaps it will become clearer when I will say more about those disappointments. The first disappointment was that I discovered that the new system, like the old one, had a very strong sense of the enemy. So as soon as liberal democracy began to take root in my country, I noticed that the dualistic pattern that I remember from the old days continued to exist in the new conditions. So there were two groups. There were the good guys having good ideas. There were the bad guys having bad ideas. And those who were good and had good ideas had to be respected, and those that were bad had to be condemned. And I'm not talking about sort of everyday conflicts, differences, clashes of opinions. I'm talking about the dualist that was intended to tear apart the entire society, or even in more sweeping version, the entire modern world. But what astonished me particularly was that not only the house continued to be divided, but that many bad guys were the same people, groups, or organizations who had been the bad guys in the past. And the good guys with good ideas were pretty much the same people who had been good guys in the past. So the good guys were, for instance, former communist politicians, communist intelligentsia. Most of them were the good guys, were considered to be sort of legitimate members of a new liberal democratic society. The bad guys were mostly the conservatives, right? Anti-communists, patriots who were called nationalists, and Catholics, right? Christians, Catholics in particular, and the Catholic Church. So the same people who I remember had been calling for the workers of the world to unite against the reactionaries. We're now in a new situation, calling all the good liberals and good Democrats to unite against the very same reactionaries. So in my country, there emerged a very strange but also strong alliance, surprising, shocking to many, an alliance between some of the former oppositionists and some of the former communist intellectuals and politicians, and together, as a group, turned out to be very influential. They immediately declare themselves to be the midwives, so to speak, the midwives of the new political system, and its only legitimate guardians. So that's disappointment number one. Now, disappointment number two. What I found disturbing in the liberal democratic society was the political language that was used. The political language which was not that of freedom, but was the language of necessity. One would have thought that once the old regime was abolished, freedom would be the first principle to embrace. I mean, freedom to think, to speak, to build institutions, to create, to discover, right, to search for the truth. But this was not the case, at least not entirely. From day one, we were made to accept that there already exists a blueprint for a good liberal democratic society. It's there, it's ready, it's been invented, right? And so it's not only institutions, it's not only law, it's an entire package, right? Liberal democracy was sort of presented to us as a package which contained a lot of things, right? Institutions, but also norms, right? Ideas, stereotypes, certain forms of imagination. We were made to believe that these things are there, they have to be accepted, they have to be implemented. No more inventions, no more eccentricities. We have to follow the path that others have already passed before and showed us the direction. I remember a debate among my colleagues right after the fall of the regime. We had a debate which direction our university should go. Now that everything is possible, what should we do? Right? What should we do? How should we try to change the university, the way it works and functions, and everything? And the reaction of my colleagues, the vast majority of my colleagues, was unanimous. That is, they say we should not try to discover America. Right? We should be like any other good university, from Vancouver in Canada to Auckland, New Zealand. The new system has its imperatives, to which we have to give our assent, and it don't only apply to university, but to everything, right? To law, to all sorts of education, to morality, even to entertainment. I mean, no matter what problem you open up and ask this, what should we do? Well, there is not much we should do, because we know, well, the prescription is there, right? You have to just implement it. So what it amounts to is that we were told something like this. Now, because you are free, you must do this. And this internal contradiction went almost unnoticed. For a lot of people, it was natural. Yes, we are free, we must do it. Disappointment number three. I was shocked, first surprised, then astonished, and then shocked by the degree of social engineering. From the beginning, the new system set in motion a program of social engineering. It wasn't called social engineering, but But clearly, that what it was. And again, the language that was used was most revealing. We could use, at least I deduced an analogy between what was going on in Poland after World War II, when the communists seized power, came to Poland on the Soviet tanks, and what happened in 1989 when the new system was being installed. Of course, it's not a question of violence, brutality, not being people murdered, but I'm talking about the language, right? Because when the communists came to Poland, they seized power, they didn't say, well, we will kill everybody, right? We will put to prison people. What they say was that we live in a completely new situation, and in a completely new situation, we need completely new people. We have to create a new man, homo novus, right? Because the old man, the man belonging to the past, that was the phrase used, will disappear sooner or later. The new times, right? The new times require new people, require new thinking. So this was, and new thinking requires getting rid of old thinking, right? And requires changing people into completely new human entities, so to speak. So, and then almost the same language reappeared some 40 years later. New situation, liberal democracy, new men, right? New people, new minds. The mind had to be changed, restructured, reshaped, educated, re-educated, whatever, even recycled, right? In order to have the new order, economic, political, intellectual, we need new minds, and we have to create those minds. What was particularly strange about it, that 10 years before, when we had the Solidarity movement, 1980, 1991, the movement that shook the communist empire in Eastern Europe, that movement was composed of not new men, there was not homo novus, there were men belonging to the past. These were workers, priests, patriots, churchgoers, respectable men and women attached to tradition, to Polish and European culture. So these were, in a new situation, from a new perspective, these people who dealt a deadly blow to the system were now considered to be living anachronisms, right? They had to be either to be mentally reformed or to be thrown into a dustbin of history. So these three, and there were other, of course, experiences, I found disconcerting, the more so that I knew that they were not limited to my country, but they were, you could find them everywhere, not only in the former Soviet colonies, but also of in the western part of Europe, to say the least, right? So the more I thought about it, the more it became clear to me that there must be some sort of reason why these things are happening, and there must be some kind of intellectual, philosophical parallelism, right, between a typical communist and a typical Democrat. They must have something in common. So I started thinking about it and wrote articles, essays, and after several years, I wrote a book. So the book's thesis is simple, but it has rather complex set of complex arguments. Whoever read the book probably will agree with me that there are many arguments that are difficult to summarize. But for the sake of this talk, I can summarize the argument that substantiates this thesis. And this argument would be something like this. What makes communism and liberal democracy akin or consonant with each other is that in each political system, politics, or well, let's put it differently, that in each case, the political system is so dominant that it permeates the entire social fabric, all institutions, norms, also human minds. So just as communism provided the ultimate frame of reference for everything that was happening in the communist society, so we are beginning to live in a system where liberal democracy also provides such a frame of reference for everything that is happening in society. In communism, it was in the nature of the old regime that everything had to be communist or socialist. We rather used in Eastern Europe, we rather used the word socialist, which meant the same, practically the same. Not only practically, but theoretically too. So everything had to be communist and be called communist or socialist. So not a family, but a socialist family. Not morality, but a socialist morality. Not society, socialist art, and so on, and so on. So much later, it came back to me, much later, I was somehow dismayed to discover that also in a liberal democratic society, it is expected that everything should be liberal or democratic, or everything should reflect, illustrate the liberal democratic logic. Family should become liberalized and democratized, so should schools, moral, social norms. It is even assumed that religion and churches will become more liberal and more democratic, both in the practice and in the doctrines. Even God has come to resemble a liberal democrat. Just as in communism, God, who you know did not exist, was somebody like a good communist. I mean, let's be frank. I mean, that roughly what it amount to. So I reformulated the thesis somewhat and made it more precise and said that in both systems there is an inexorable, inherent tendency to politicization. That is, both systems tend to impose structures, procedures, principles, presuppositions on every aspect of society, on people's lives, thoughts, actions, on everything. And not only do those systems impose those principles, structures, presuppositions, but they believe this imposition to be necessary, beneficial, desired by people, and being, what's more important, being in accordance with the general current of the civilization. This is the direction which the world is going. Well, the communist politicization was indeed very was comprehensive, and comprehensive in scope, was painfully intrusive. No wonder that for some people it became unbearable. Well, people couldn't stand it. And those who defied the system looked for some areas that were not touched by politics yet. And in these areas, they wanted to find a refuge from political aggression. These could be private lives, right? Private life, family life, art, intellectual pursuits, religion. Of course, in practice, it was very difficult because the authorities knew very well that people were trying to escape and to somehow evade the obligations imposed on them by these authorities. So the authorities did their best to annex those areas, to incorporate them into the political dominion. But certainly that's what many people were doing. That is, family and private life seem to be obvious fortresses within which one could find security, peace, and somehow feel safe from this omnipresence, ubiquity of official ideology and propaganda. But there were other fortresses, memory, right, art, beauty, literature, religion, right? Going to church with its liturgy, right? The word of Gospels, mystery, spirituality, was going to a different world. And since the Catholic Church was very powerful in Poland, even though the church was viciously attacked by communists, at least up to a certain moment, it still became strong enough that when you go to the church, you went to the church, you find yourself in an entirely different world. So, but as I said, the communists were quite aware of these strategies and did everything they could to conquer or reconquer those territories. It was especially true in the early stages of the communist reign, when the new ideology had this sense of superiority, right, and power, even pride, I would say. So there was the attack on the private life, on the family life. One should not forget that the communists were the world's avant-garde of the changes. They were the first to have divorces easily obtainable and accessible, the first to introduce abortion on demand, the first to empower the young against the old, students against teachers, children against parents. And so in most areas, I mean, if you watch the development, right, the growth of the communist system, as it became weaker, the grip on society, on people's minds was loosening. So, but the method to control these things was to introduce and then to enforce a criterion, in fact, the criterion. There was the criterion of correctness. That is, everything that was, since everything was political and since politics was regulated by ideology, so it was obvious that everything had to be compatible with the ideology, and no dissonant notes were allowed. So there were no innocuous remarks or innocuous acts. Everything had to be compatible, or if it's not compatible, then, well, there was a problem. But when the communist system was loosening its grip on people, this criterion was slowly replaced by the criterion of non-contradiction. That is, it was assumed that words and actions must not be in contradiction with the communist ideology. In an explicit contradiction. So this marked an important change, because initially this criterion was stricter. So, and this compatibility or congruence was called correctness, and correctness replaced truth, beauty, and so on. The problem with the correctness was that each time it had to be shown, it had to be displayed, it had to be proved, because it could be proved by a gesture, right, a word, a signal. So everybody had to make an effort to prove that well, this does not contradict, or this is congruent, right, with the ideology, in order to preempt all possible doubts and accusations. Of course, that gave other people an opportunity to trace and hunt down those who were too reckless or too lazy or too naive to make the correctness manifest. Now, well, that's communist, that's history. Now, let us turn to liberal democracy. If what I said about the omnipresence of politics, the omnipresence of liberal and democratic principles in today's Western societies, if what I said is true, I think it is legitimate to ask ourselves, how strong are these or similar fortresses, the possible places of refuge within which some of us could try to hide those who are put off by the new tides of liberal democratic political offensives. How strong, for example, is today is the private sphere, right? A family life, how strong it is protected against these liberal democratic political crusades. Are our private lives more secure now than they were, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago? Or are they less secure? To what extent are our thoughts imbued with the liberal and democratic ideas when we think of a family or try to organize our family life or give advice to our friends on family matters, right? How much our thoughts, our words are full of the political content? Are we more inclined or less inclined than before to speak of family using such political terms as power, empowerment, equality, gender, rights? Or law, let us take law. Is law more involved or less involved in regulating family relations? Or take sex, which is the most private of all private things. Has sex become, over the past decades, more or less a matter taken up and regulated by governments, courts, legislatures, all sorts of agencies? Or take other things, art, religion, literature, history. Are they providing today, do they have a better protection against liberal democratic politics? Or perhaps this protection is weaker, and some areas is disappearing altogether. Or language. Let us take language. Is language free from political intervention today, or is it more politically controlled? Can one easily publish a book or an article that does not accord with the regulations of the politically acceptable jargon? Are the restrictions more severe or less severe now? Is the language that is being taught at schools the language of English and American literature, or is it the language more and more resemble the gobbledygook of current political ideologies? And there are all sorts of questions like this. I draw particular attention to the language because I remember from my own life one of the first signals that mark the beginning of more widespread opposition to the system back in 1970s. That was all of a sudden the language became the issue. There was a wave of poets, a group of poets, because it's called a new wave, right? A new wave of poetry. And there were different poets, of course, but what joined them together was this sensitivity to language. That is, that language is the first object of the attack, and the first stage of emancipation. You have to emancipate language. You have to use the language in order to describe your experience, right? To name an object, right? Not to be given a ready-made system of concepts which contain a lie, right, and manipulate your vision, right, of the world, your picture of the world. So this is extremely important. I mean, the language. So when some years later I was watching what was happening with the English language, I must say, I became very sad because for us, also English language, like French language, where the noble type of human creations, and the language was a way to search for the truth. Right? The English, in this noble standards, right, was a language that adequately described a certain type of experience. It was not manipulated. It was not an artificial construction by ideologues. So that was quite sad when we saw what was happening to the English language, to French in some way too, but English was particularly the language of William Shakespeare was particularly well violated. Well, anyway, be it as it may, there are a slightly more concrete subject, which is a consequence of what I said before. Maybe let us try to discuss possible relations between what I can call liberal democratic orthodoxy and those places of refuge. That's what can be a possible attitude of a liberal democrat to the enclaves, the parts of a society that are not liberal, not democratic, right? They are aristocratic, they are hierarchic, and so on. So the first possible relation is that of neutrality. That is, we could say that the liberal democratic system simply ignores what ideas are being pursued and upheld. They may be monarchic, they may be communist, anarchist, nihilist, anything, right? Now, this possibility seems to me, I must admit, rather hypothetical than real. I seriously doubt whether a liberal democratic system can be neutral with regards to many such fortresses. I'm not saying that it's to crush them immediately, but certainly it's not neutral, and it's very hard to imagine liberal democratic system to be neutral. First, democracy. I mean, democracy contains an inherent mechanism of politicization. That's obvious, because democracy is the system that involves more people than any other system in the political process. I mean, that's just a fact. So there is nothing in democracy that would prevent the demos from imposing a stamp of politics, this political decision on private matters, for example, and to make those private matters subservient to the current political pieties of the demos. With liberalism, it is even more obvious, but somehow more complicated. I think liberalism has two, and I'm talking mostly about classical liberalism. With the later version of liberalism, it is even clearer. But liberalism, I believe, has two features, at least two features, which make it resistant to neutrality. First, the concept of human nature in liberalism is that of a private person, right? A liberal man is a private man. You remember the a famous essay by Benjamin Constant about the difference between the liberty of the ancients and liberty of the moderns. Well, liberty of the moderns, he said, the freedom of the moderns is the freedom in private matters, not political freedom, because we are not so much concerned with politics. We are concerned with gardening, marriage, children, money, property, well, things like this. So a liberal man is a private man, essentially. But liberalism, as a theory, is essentially political. Whatever the liberals say, it is political. It's super political theory. Because the aim of liberalism is impose its order on the entirety of human arrangements. Because liberals consider themselves superior to other, I mean logically superior. I'm not talking about mental or psychological sense of superiority. I'm talking about logical superiority. Here we organize our lives, and then come liberals and say, well, there is something wrong in it, so we will organize for you the rules according to which you will pursue your objectives, right? So liberalism is considered to be sort of a theory of the second order, right? A meta theory. But also liberalism is political because it's built on dichotomies. I mean, liberals are obsessed with dichotomies. Freedom, authority, right? Individual rights, government's prerogatives, and liberty, despotism. They always talk about despotism. So this is a paradoxical combination. A liberal man is a private person concerned with individual pursuits, money, property, career, and so on and so on. But the system is political. So it's obvious that the walls that surround the privacy will be destroyed by liberalism, because the only sort of political matter that is obvious for a liberal are the private things, right? The private matters. This is the products, the commodities with which he comes to the public square. So we cannot, right, expect any protection from theory of liberalism, practice of liberalism to safeguard our private lives. So for that reason, I do not believe that the liberal democracy will tolerate or will somehow let it go and keep these enclaves intact. The second possible relation between liberal democracy and those places, areas of refuge, is compatibility or congruence, right? We say that we tolerate only those things that are compatible with liberal democratic orthodoxy. And the liberal Democrats say this does not imply limitation of liberties, because liberal democracy is the freest, most open, most pluralistic, most tolerant of all political systems. So by enforcing liberal democratic standards, we in fact enforce plurality, freedom, tolerance, openness, and so on and so on. So if you formulate this argument like this, it sounds rather strange. In fact, it is kind of dodgy. But it's the argument I very often hear in the European Union. That's exactly what they're doing. I mean, that's what they are what they are saying. And we have to impose those standards, no matter, because these are the best standards, and you shut up and abide by those standards. But it's easy to see that the core of the argument is semantic. It's not empirical. That if you define liberalism as a theory of a movement which is in favor of freedom, if you define democracy as a system that supports the power of the people, then obviously liberal democracy is something that makes the world freer and people more empowered. But that's a definition. It does not translate itself into reality. But if you believe in this definition, and you believe that the definition is distinguishable from reality, so if you define liberal democracy or liberalism and democracy separately like that, then once you said that you are liberal, means that you are free. I mean, you want freedom. Whatever you do, whatever you order people to do, you make the world freer. You make him free. Yeah? But that's this mixing analytical statements and empirical propositions is not only typical of liberal democrats. I mean, other orientations do it also, like aristocracy. If you define aristocracy as a rule of the best and the virtuous, then of course aristocratic system is a system of the by definition is the system of the best and the virtuous. But in real life, an elite that call itself democracy may be just a gang of thugs, right? They don't have to be virtuous and noble. There is also this possible another relation is that of non-contradiction. I think I started talking about it, but its non-contradiction is that only you liberal democracy just doesn't care about those fortresses, right, or enclaves, as long as they do not explicitly contradict the liberal democratic principles. This is a rather obscure statement because it's not clear what contradicts liberal democracy. If you ask a typical liberal democrat what contradicts the liberal democracy, he would probably say that fascism. Yeah, fascism is an obvious contradiction of liberal democracy, and you do not allow the activities of fascist groups. Yeah, but yes, but as I said, fascism is a term rather obscure, so it doesn't mean much. If you'd ask a liberal democrat whether the same applies to communists, a liberal democrat would probably evade an answer or give an answer that is not quite clear. But that's not really the main problem. The main problem is that in a democracy over the last decades, there appeared more and more words, protean, obscure, right, elusive, easy to manipulate, easy to use as political weapons that are meant to denote things that are not compatible with liberal democracy, like nationalism. Well, that's an old concept, of course, like xenophobia, homophobia, sexism. So I think one cannot resist the feeling, or indeed something more than a feeling, that what is not being permitted has been growing, whereas what is being permitted seems to be decreasing. Again, I have an association with the communist system. Well, toute proportion gardée, I mean, always should be added. There's a well-known statement from the history of communists that the class struggle intensifies with the development of the communist society. So that was meant to explain why we are nearer and nearer the communist paradise, but more and more people are being arrested, right, or executed. And the answer was, well, that's normal, because the closer you are to the paradise, the enemies become more and more dangerous. So, as I said, toute proportion gardée, we can say that the closer we are to the ideal liberal democracy, the more menacing are the danger it has to stand up against, and fierce are the battles to fight. There's all sorts of battles that are being fought, right, with or against the enemies. So once we agree that what makes communism and liberal democracy similar is an unusually high degree of politicization, we are faced with two possibilities. The first possibility is that the communists were right in their belief that political systems should dominate the entirety of social life, every aspect of social life. But what they made a mistake was in identifying the system that should dominate. It was communism. It was a very costly error. In other words, there is nothing wrong with the omnipresence of politics as long as the political system is good. Communism was no good, so the pervasiveness of communist politics was not good either. The second possibility is that communists were wrong on both counts. That is, not only the system was bad, but politicization as such is bad, no matter what the system, whatever the system. If we choose the first possibility, of course, my book, the thesis of my book crumbles. We can say that there is nothing wrong with these similarities because they are merely formal, not substantive. The forms may be similar, omnipresence of ideology and politics, but the substance in each system is different. Democratic politics is good, communist politics was bad. But if we choose the second possibility and say that the invasion of politics into every nook and cranny is bad, regardless of the nature of political system, then we are in a position to raise a serious objection against liberal democracy, accusing it of totalizing ambitions. And this opens a very important question, namely how to curb those ambitions and whether the liberal democratic system has its own instruments to curb such ambitions, to do the job. The problem is indeed a fundamental one because the liberal democracy is a system which seems to meet all good criteria, all the criteria of good government, right? It has a plurality of political parties, it has also freedom, separation of powers, elections, and yet these are not enough to prevent those phenomena from happening. The liberal democracy seems to be unable to engender any form of self-restraint. Therefore, the problem may not be structural and not a structural solution, but the problem lies deeper in sort of more profound assumptions. And now I come to the final point of what I wanted to say, namely, I would like to enumerate those 4 assumptions which I think are sort of deeper and that join, put together communist and liberal democracy. For some, these assumptions are obvious, but I don't think they are. Well, the first assumption is common to both communism and liberal democracy. I mean, both of these systems have been the greatest political dreams in modern history. No other political projects have been so universally hailed as the ultimate realization of people's aspiration. The human race, it was believed, could not go any further in political evolution than communism in one case, socialism, and liberal democracy in the other. I mean, that's the end. You may make it more perfect, right? You can try to improve it. Make communism more communist. You can make liberal democracy more liberal democratic. But that's it. So there is no alternative thinking. I mean, any thinking in terms of an alternative just cease to exist. So if there are no alternatives, I mean, if any conversation about an alternative is impossible, then there is no reason why the liberal democracy and the communists should be extended without limits, right? everywhere. In other words, the dedicated communists and dedicated liberal Democrats, I think, suffer from the same error, the error of big dreamers, which one might call a misplacement of perfection. That is, real perfection lies elsewhere, not in politics, certainly not in political arrangements. Point number 2. Since both systems are considered ultimate and having no alternative, there is no compromise with the critics. The critics are not just critics, but they are enemies. One does not seriously enter into a debate with an enemy. A communist did not enter into a serious debate with a non-communist. A liberal democrat will not enter into a serious debate or any debate at all with a non-democrat, right? So the consequence of this is emergence of something like a united front, right? We had a united front in communism, but we have something like today. I'm not going to say anything about the United States, but certainly there is something in it in Europe. This is particularly true of the European Union, which has been for many years ruled by the united front, by a permanent majority. I mean, permanent, which is, it continues to exist no matter what the results of the elections are. It's the same majority. And it's a very strong majority, because it's the majority which is political, that is a grand coalition of parties. This is a sort of eschatological, if you will, teleological majority, because they believe in this final goal, right, at the end of history, always receding, of course, which is an ever closer union. I mean, that's what they say, an ever closer union, or more Europe in Europe, more Europe every day. And it's also, of course, ideological. That is, it's composed, they have one ideology composed of all leftist ideologies that are around today. This, in fact, has undermined the classical division between the left and right. In the European Union, there is no division between the left and right, because they are together, the grand coalition. So this, what emerged was what is called the mainstream politics, right? You have to be in the mainstream. You may be on the left, on the right, doesn't matter. What matters is you have to be in the mainstream. You have to accept the ruling orthodoxy, which means, in fact, that this so-called democratic pendulum has become obsolete or even redundant, sometimes even harmful. Some elections are harmful. They shouldn't have taken place, right? We had it in Irish referendum, right? It was to ratify the Lisbon Treaty, right? The Irish said no in the first referendum. Then it had to be repeated because the results were not acceptable. Doesn't mean that I have to. Fine. Okay. I'm just near the end. So that's assumption number 2. Assumption number 3 is that both systems are great experiments in modernization, and they were conceived and they're interpreted and they are thought of as great experiment in modernization. Not only modernization in institutions, but also modernizations of life, right? Modernization of people, modernization of culture. Everything has to be modernized. No wonder, like education, right? Like art, like morality, and modernization, of course, allows a serious intrusion into social fabric. So this makes the communists and liberals hubristic. That is, they feel disdain for barriers, for limits, for natural restraints, taboos. And, the communists try to reverse the current of the Siberian rivers. The liberal Democrats redefine marriage and family. And point number 4 is they both, I think, accept the same anthropology. which I call in my book Anthropology of a Common Man, common not in any social sense, but in an anthropological sense. That is, equality is believed to be a natural condition, a natural sort of state of human nature. Not only equality of people, but also equality of soul. There is no distinction, which we know from philosophy, right, between the higher part of the soul and the lower part of the soul. Everything is equal. So, and equality, as we know from Tocqueville and a lot of other people, right, Ortega y Gasset engenders uniformity and conformity. So that's about it. I mean, there is, of course, the last question that may be asked. What is to be done and how to change the system? I can say that it's not I didn't address this question in the book because it's, I believe it's not an interesting question for a historian of philosophy like myself. But it is a very interesting question for a politician like myself. But I postpone the answer to this question to another occasion when I will be even more talkative than today. And on this note of suspense, I rest my case.